The snow came sideways across the two-lane county road like a curtain of torn lace, shredding the world into shivering fragments of white and shadow. And Officer Ethan Hale, 34, clean-shaven with a square jaw and a faint pale scar along his left cheekbone from a glass shard in a bar fight 6 years back, kept both hands steady on the steering wheel of his cruiser. Eyes narrowed behind the matte black rims of his prescription lenses as the wipers scythed a rhythm that sounded like a tired heartbeat. He was broad-shouldered in his winter duty jacket, the navy fabric stiff with cold. The reflective police letters glazed with ice, and beneath the jacket he wore the same faded grey thermal he'd worn on blizzard shifts since he'd transferred from Detroit to this stretch of rural county. Hard snow country, where his calm voice and deliberate, methodical manner had earned him a reputation as the officer who didn't rattle. The man who would take the extra 12 minutes to think before he raised his voice or his weapon, a habit hammered into him by a paramedic father who had taught him on night drives to notice the small things, the overlooked things. The way frost clung unevenly to a windshield, the way a set of footsteps curved into a ditch and then didn't come out. And it was exactly that habit that made him see the smear in the headlight cone 200 yards ahead. Something low and dark crossing the road. Not a deer, not a fox, but a shape that moved with a purposeful limp. A silhouette shouldering a wind that made every tree groan. He eased off the accelerator and rolled to a stop, amber hazard lights strobing through the whiteout. And when he opened the door, the cold knifed into the cabin and burned his teeth, and he tasted the metallic tang of snow. Then he saw the dog clearly for the first time, a large German shepherd with the broad chest and heavy head of a working K9, 6 or 7 years old by the silvering at the muzzle. Coat a weathered saddle of black and tan, matted with ice. Left foreleg dark with blood from a gash that had frozen into a crusted rind. Gait tight but stubborn. Eyes a hard, intelligent brown that skipped past Ethan's flashlight beam and locked onto the cruiser as if the car itself were a person who could be persuaded to follow. The dog wore a torn tactical harness, black nylon scuffed to a dull charcoal. One strap snapped and flapping like a pennant. The chest panel stamped with ghosted white letters that the snow had half erased. K9, while a Velcro patch on the side showed a frayed emblem Ethan couldn't read. Every instinct he had told him this was not a stray and not a farm dog gone wandering. This was a trained animal with a job undone, a partner separated from a handler, and the realization rose with an electric jolt that made him set his jaw against the wind and call out, not loud, just steady. "Hey buddy, easy," because tone mattered with dogs and also with people, and tone had once saved his life in a winter alley when a scared kid with a pistol and the breath of alcohol had believed Ethan when he'd said, "We can fix this." So now he held that same tone in the storm and watched the shepherd, who trotted closer with his head low and ears pinned, as if fighting the urge to collapse, then planted himself at the cruiser's bumper and looked up into Ethan's face, something pleading but firm in that gaze, and lifted the injured paw as if to show it, and then set it down and took 2 steps backward into the white, glanced over his shoulder, returned to the bumper again, and touched cold nose to metal with a quick tap. And Ethan understood it the way you understand a well-made sign on a dark road. The dog was not asking. He was instructing. "Follow me." Ethan thumbed his radio, and the county dispatcher, a woman named Roz, with the brisk coffee-fueled cadence of someone who could triage 1,000 small disasters without blinking, crackled in his ear. "Unit 7, status." And he said, "Unit 7 on Route 23 near mile marker 41. Whiteout conditions, possible K9 in distress, tactical harness, unknown agency, bleeding from the foreleg. I'm going to follow, low speed." And Roz came back with an edge of worry he'd only heard twice in 3 winters. "Copy 7. Use caution. No additional units within 15 out. We've got multiple slide-offs southbound. You want EMS on standby?" And he said, "Affirm. Keep them warm. Because you learned to speak your requests like you were writing them in ice that might crack under too much weight." He flipped the cruiser into low, eased forward, and the shepherd moved like a storm-hardened guide down the road, staying just inside the halo of his headlights. Flickers of snow silvering his coat. The limp pronounced but his determination, like a rope tugging Ethan's hands on the wheel. And as he followed, the old grief stirred like a sleeping animal in his chest. The memory of Officer Caleb Morris, his first partner, whose easy grin and soft drawl had masked a habit of cutting corners, of assuming the best when he should have prepared for the worst. And on a February night 2 years ago, Caleb's shortcut had been a narrow bridge on black ice, where a van had fishtailed across the center line and taken him and a woman in a red Civic into the river. And the way the cold had taken his breath as he went over the guardrail to try. The way the world goes blindingly quiet underwater until all that's left is the thudding drum of your heart begging you to rise. Ethan had risen. The woman had too. But Caleb hadn't. And from that night, he carried a vow like a steadying weight. No shortcuts in the cold. No assumptions when visibility is a lie. So he kept his distance from the shepherd, watched for the unexpected, and when the dog veered suddenly into an unplowed access road between two wind-lashed spruces, he hesitated long enough to scan for a mailbox or a private drive sign. Saw neither, then guided the cruiser in, tires crunching through drifts that clawed the bumper. The engine growling with the effort as powder fanned up like smoke around the hood. The beam of his spotlight struck a shape. A chain-link gate shoved crooked on its hinges, padlock broken. One post leaned like a tooth in a socket. Beyond it, a utility track packed by fresh, heavy treads, snow still collapsing into them with a hiss. And it made sense in that quick way a cop's mind does the math. A site not meant for tourists, someone had forced entry. And the dog knew this trail. Ethan stepped out again, the wind angrier here as if it resented that this path existed. And the shepherd circled him once, brushing his leg in a pass that felt almost like checking him for stability, then took off down the track with a determined, head-low trot. Ethan returned to the seat, rolled the gate further open with the push bar, and drove, hazard lights pulsing a metronome of amber that washed the trees in brief, sickly warmth. And as he advanced, the radio spit another voice. Highway Patrol Trooper Marquez, a woman in her early 40s who kept her dark hair in a braided crown and had a voice like gravel and honey, the kind that made impounded truckers confess out of respect. Unit 7, this is 2 Alpha 14. I'm 30 minutes out from your location if you need backup. And Ethan said, Copy, 2 Alpha 14. Following a wounded K9 on a utility track north of 23. Gate's been breached. I may be out of radio range in a minute. And Marquez said, Keep your head down, Hale. A phrase that meant more than it said. The track curved, dipped, then opened into a broad cut where a service clearing ran under a latticework of high blue steel towers, the power lines singing a ghostly hum that made the hair on Ethan's forearms rise even through the layers of fleece. The shepherd stopped there, chest heaving, and looked back, and in that single look Ethan read fatigue, urgency, and something like grief. And he thought not of dogs, but of partners, handlers, fellow officers, the human whose scent must be all over that harness. And he spoke softly again. Lead on. And the dog pivoted and plunged toward the tree line on the clearing's far side, where the snow lay deeper and untracked, but for the new path the shepherd carved, and Ethan followed on foot this time, boots breaking the crust with sharp, starved crunches, his breath a hard engine in his chest, one hand on his radio mic and the other on the maglite that threw a tunnel of cold light across the world. 10 yards into the trees, the wind dropped, replaced by the muffled quiet of snow-loaded branches, the kind of silence that makes every distant sound ring like a bell. The drip of melt off a twig, the tiny creak of wood shifting under ice. And in that silence, another sound became clear. A faint, intermittent chirp, electronic, regular, like a wounded bird with a perfect metronome. And as he moved, closer he recognized it because once you've done winter searches with EMS, you never forget the sound of an emergency locator beacon. The shepherd's ears pricked and he let out a low chuff as if to say, Now you understand. And Ethan pushed through a thicket that snagged his jacket, broke into a small ravine where the snow was piled in odd angles over something bulkier than earth, and his light found it, a dark shape wedged nose down against a stump. The back end lifted, snow caked across shattered glass and twisted metal, the faint glow of a dying taillight bleeding through ice like a trapped ember. It was an SUV, black or navy, civilian, but outfitted with a front brush guard and a whip antenna. The rear quarter panel stenciled with numbers he could not yet read under the snow, and the world narrowed to the practical, the way it always did for him in crisis, scan for hazards, fuel, fire risk, electrical lines, structural instability. The beacon chirp was louder, strobing from somewhere inside the vehicle, and the shepherd was at the rear hatch, one paw lifted, whining, a thin, high sound he could not suppress, tapping the metal with the nails of his good forepaw as if knocking on a locked door. Ethan shouldered through the drift to the driver's side, wiped snow with his forearm until his glove soaked through, and peered between crackled glass freckles. A deployed airbag like a burst mushroom, a steering wheel slicked with frost, a faint fog inside from breath that might be his own reflection, or might be a human trying to stay in the world. He angled his light and saw her, because it was a her, in the driver's seat, head slumped against the airbag, hair stuck to her temple with blood. A woman in her early 30s with pale olive skin and dark lashes, a strong square chin, and a mouth that in waking would have set firmly when she made decisions. And she wore a winterized duty uniform under a black tactical coat with a small silver shield pinned to the breast. Eyes closed, lips parted, an oxygen mask tangled near her knee as if she'd tried to access a first aid kit and lost consciousness mid-reach. Her hands were bare and raw at the knuckles, and a half-unzipped duffel on the passenger seat revealed a folded ballistic vest, a trauma dressing packet, and a laminated ID card with a frosted photo he couldn't read. And there in the passenger footwell was another shape, small, bundled, a knit cap with a bright pom-pom, a child's mitten with a felt fox sewn on. And he felt the blood drain from his face even as his training kicked in, because the chirp was not only a vehicle beacon, it was a personal locator, the kind issued to law enforcement and sometimes to children in protective custody. He spoke into the radio, voice steady by force of will. Unit 7 to dispatch. I have a single SUV down in a ravine off the utility track north of mile 41. One adult female unconscious, one possible juvenile occupant, status unknown. Vehicle appears off-road with front-end impact, no fire, requesting immediate EMS and rescue with winch capability. I will attempt access now. And Roz's voice was thinner and static but still present. Copy 7, EMS staged at Cider Mill Road and 23, sending volunteer fire with winch. ETA 15 to 20, your signal's weak. Keep talking as able. And he clicked twice in acknowledgement because words would waste breath. The shepherd moved to him, pressed his flank against Ethan's thigh like a living brace. And in that contact, Ethan felt the trembling funnel of the dog's exhaustion and resolve, the hot engine of an animal who had walked hurt through a storm because the people behind the glass were his. And Ethan said, "Good boy." The old universal liturgy, and then he wedged his shoulder against the driver's door and felt it stick against a bend in the frame. He shifted to the rear passenger door and found it cracked by an inch, pried his fingers into the seam until the cold bit like fire, and heaved until the metal groaned and lurched and opened enough for him to slide inside half sideways, glass crunching under his boots. The cold inside had weight, a mean presence, and his breath fogged the cabin in gusts as he reached for the woman's carotid and found a pulse, thready but present. Then shifted his light toward the child and saw a boy of about 7, slight, pale, with freckles across the bridge of a small, stubborn nose, brown hair damp with melted snow, eyes closed, mouth parted with the faintest sound of breath whistling at the edge of a cough, a seat belt trapping him at an angle that looked wrong for his spine. The knit cap had a name stitched on the inside seam, Ben, and the sight of the name was a small, intimate blow, because names make everything heavier. He slid a hand under the boy's head, propped him gently with a folded trauma blanket from the duffel, and spoke in the same calm, even tone he'd used on panicked teens and drunk fathers, and once a woman whose hand was trapped in a snowblower. "Ben, you're all right. You're with me. You're safe." And the boy's eyelids fluttered like moth wings, but did not open. From the driver's seat, the woman made a sound, a low throb that might have been a word trying to find its shape, and the shepherd thrust his head through the opening with a grunt, licking at her gloved fingers where they lay limp, then backed out again to stand guard, ears up, scanning the trees with the practiced vigilance of a sentry. Ethan stabilized the woman's neck with his hands, cursing the absence of a collar or brace, then used the trauma dressing to tape a butterfly over the cut above her brow to slow the bleeding, worked the boy's seatbelt free with a practiced thumb on the jammed release, and once the slack was there, he kept him still, unwilling to move him further without a backboard. He told himself to catalogue details: the faint chemical bite in the air that said coolant, the pattern of glass that suggested a rollover and a final slide, the lack of footprints around the vehicle that meant no one else had walked away, the way the duffel was packed with exactly the gear a prepared officer would load if she'd been moving a child across county lines in a storm, the torn harness on the shepherd that suggested he had either leapt from the SUV at the moment of impact or cut himself free later to go for help. And as pieces arranged themselves into a provisional narrative, the woman's eyes cracked open to narrow slits, and he saw in them a color like wet bark, and a disbelief that sharpened into recognition of uniform and badge. And she breathed, hoarse, Did he get you?" And Ethan said, "No one got me. I'm Hale. You're all right." And she swallowed, tried again. "The man, black pickup, hit us, forced us, took the case," and her gaze snapped sideways toward the rear cargo area, where a rectangle of clean absence lay in the dust on the rubber mat. The shape of something once strapped there, a hard case, maybe 18 inches by 24, and the story shifted again, uglier and bigger, because robberies and storms are not accidents, and cases that size don't hold lunches. Outside in the cold, the shepherd gave a short, clipped bark, not a demand, a signal, and Ethan felt a hairline fracture of dread open along his spine. He angled his light through the shattered rear window into the woods and saw, at the edge of the beam, huge half-moons pressed into the powder, the fresh tread marks of off-road tires, curving away from the ravine and vanishing into the trees. And then he noticed something else, small, chilling. On the snow, where the vehicle had gouged to a stop, a spray of scattered paper that had bled ink in blue tears. One page catching his light enough to yield a partial letterhead, State of Michigan, Department of, before ice crystals blurred the rest, and he realized that whatever had been in the missing case was government, not household, and that the shepherd had not just brought him to a crash, but to the first step of a crime that would reach beyond a storm and a county line. Roz's voice ghosted through the static. "Unit 7, status check." And Ethan said, never taking his eyes off the trees, 2 victims located, 1 adult female law enforcement, 1 juvenile male, both alive. Initiating stabilization. Possible hostile vehicle fled the scene with evidence. Request perimeter units when able. And as he said it, the wind shifted and carried a sound that didn't belong to the forest. The faint cough of an engine turning over somewhere beyond the ridge, trying to start, failing, trying again. And the shepherd's head swiveled toward it, ears sharpened into arrows of alarm, and Ethan understood that the dog's mission was not yet complete, and the storm, with all its erasing power, was about to reveal something that would leave him. If not now, then soon, speechless. The ravine seemed to breathe around him, the hush of snow-muffled branches broken only by the failing whimper of the SUV's hazard bulb and the steady chirp of the locator beacon. And Officer Ethan Hale forced himself to focus on the rhythm of his own breath, because panic had a way of stealing oxygen before danger even arrived, and right now there were too many lives depending on his calm. The shepherd stood guard outside, body rigid despite the trembling of exhaustion, eyes sweeping the dark tree line, as if he could will himself into 4 directions at once. and Ethan kept one gloved hand on the boy Ben's chest to feel the faint rise and fall that meant he was still here, still fighting, while the other hand braced the woman in the driver's seat. Her pulse weaker than he liked, her breath hitching against the blood seeping under the makeshift bandage he'd pressed to her brow. And when she stirred again, lashes fluttering with effort, he bent close so his voice wouldn't waste itself against the storm, and he said, "Stay with me, officer. Stay with me," because the silver badge on her chest, now clearer under his light, told him she was not a civilian, but law enforcement, maybe state, maybe federal. And the weight of that realization twisted in his gut like a screw. This was no random accident. This was an ambush with intent, and the case that had been stolen from the cargo area had to be more than sensitive. It had to be critical. She managed to force out syllables, ragged and thin. They, new route, inside help, don't trust, and her eyes glazed again, slipping toward unconsciousness, leaving Ethan with the uneasy echo of betrayal in her words. Outside, the shepherd barked twice, clipped, controlled, a signal that carried training, and Ethan's own training responded. He ducked lower, swept the maglite beam across the ridge above, caught the flicker of something metallic between trunks, maybe nothing, maybe a mirror, maybe a scope, and his pulse thudded cold because the storm was no longer just weather. It was cover, and whoever had forced this vehicle off the road might still be hunting. He keyed his radio, static clawing at Roz's reply. "Unit 7, copy fragments, you safe?" And he kept his tone level. Multiple victims alive. Adult, female law enforcement. Juvenile male stable but unconscious. Possible hostile presence nearby. Urgent need for backup and air support if weather allows. Knowing air support wouldn't fly in this storm, but saying it anyway. Because sometimes words themselves bought time. He reached for the trauma kit in the duffel, tore open a thermal blanket with his teeth when his gloves fumbled, wrapped the boy Ben in its crinkling silver, whispering steady assurances that might seep into unconscious ears. "You're okay, buddy. We'll get you warm. We'll get you home." And in those words he felt his father's voice echoing from years ago, the way the man would talk to patients in ambulances, not just to reassure them, but to anchor himself, to keep the fear at bay by narrating hope. The shepherd nudged his leg again, nails clicking against metal, eyes urgent, and Ethan knew the dog wanted him out of the car, wanted him aware, because danger was not finished. He angled his body to shield both child and woman as best he could, drew his sidearm with his free hand, and scanned the ridge again. The snow, a living thing that erased edges. And then he heard it, the faint cough and stutter of an engine turning, failing, turning again, closer this time, no longer background, but intention moving toward them. He cursed under his breath because he had victims he could not move safely, a dog that would throw himself into fire, and a storm that swallowed reinforcements whole, and his mind sketched options like blueprints on ice. Hold position and risk being flanked. Move them and risk spinal damage to the boy. Split from the dog and risk losing both. The woman stirred once more, forcing out a word that sounded like evidence. Keep safe. And her hand twitched toward the boy as if to tether her mission to him. And Ethan understood with a lurch that the missing case was not the only target, that the boy himself might be the prize, and that knowledge hammered steel into his spine. He shifted his stance, radioed one last burst to Roz. "If I go dark, priority is extraction of one juvenile male. Repeat, extraction priority, juvenile male." Then he holstered the radio, steadied his weapon, and nodded to the shepherd, who lowered his body into a crouch of readiness despite the torn foreleg, lips peeling back just enough to show teeth. A wounded sentinel prepared to bleed again for the people who were his pack. Snow hissed down harder, erasing tracks as quickly as they were made, and in that moment Ethan felt the universe contract to a single resolve. No matter who was coming down that ridge, no matter what storm or betrayal had led to this crash, he would not let the child be taken. He would not let the woman die unseen, and he would not ignore the silent demand in the shepherd's eyes that said, without words, Stand with me until the end." The storm thickened until it felt like the world was a shaken globe of snow. The wind pressing against Ethan Hale's ears so hard he swore he could hear his own pulse in the pressure. Yet beneath that roar came another sound, a stutter and cough of a stubborn engine trying to force life into itself, grinding closer through the trees until even the shepherd growled low, his chest vibrating against Ethan's boot, a sound more warning than threat, a sound that said danger was seconds away. Ethan adjusted his stance inside the crumpled SUV, pressing one shoulder against the doorframe to shield both the unconscious woman officer and the boy Ben wrapped in the foil blanket. And he raised his sidearm, every sense narrowed into the tunnel of anticipation that preceded contact, his scar tingling with the memory of broken glass and past fights. And then the headlights cut the storm like pale knives, two beams sweeping across the ravine as a black pickup nosed forward with the aggression of a predator, grille armored, tires chewing snow, steam curling from the hood like smoke from nostrils. And in the cab he glimpsed shadows, 2, maybe 3 men, faces obscured by masks and the reflection of light, but movements too deliberate to be stranded. Good Samaritans, these were hunters coming back for prey they had failed to finish. Ethan whispered to the woman, though he knew she likely couldn't hear. "Stay down, don't move." Then met the shepherd's eyes and gave the faintest nod, an unspoken pact formed in the crucible of necessity. The dog limped into position near the front bumper, body lowered, every fibre of pain overridden by loyalty, and Ethan stepped out into the storm, boots crunching snow, his hazard lights painting the scene in rhythmic amber, his pistol steady in a two-handed grip as he shouted, voice slicing the wind, "Police! Cut your engine and step out." But the truck's engine only revved higher, the driver gunning it forward a foot as if mocking compliance. And a passenger window slid down to reveal the snout of a rifle wrapped in cold steel, and the shepherd barked a sharp warning that jolted Ethan into motion, rolling sideways behind the SUV as muzzle flash lit the storm in brutal strobes. Bullets chewed bark from trees and spat sparks from twisted metal, and the woman inside moaned weakly as if the world's violence was dragging her back to consciousness. Ethan returned fire. 3 controlled shots angled at the truck's front tires, one sparking off the rim, another thunking into the wheel well, the third ricocheting wide, but enough to make the driver jerk the wheel, slowing momentum just as the shepherd lunged with reckless valor, launching his injured body across the snow to clamp jaws around the passenger's arm that reached too far with the rifle. A human scream tore through the storm, raw and startled, and Ethan seized that heartbeat of distraction to sprint forward, grabbed the truck's side mirror with one hand, fired point blank into the front tire with the other, the boom muffled by snow but the impact real. The tire collapsing in a hiss that left the vehicle lurching sideways into a half spin, and in the chaos he yanked the shepherd free by the harness, dragging him back behind cover even as the dog shook blood from his muzzle, eyes blazing defiance. The masked men scrambled, one cursing as he clutched a wounded arm, another climbing from the rear with a pistol, but headlights glowed behind them suddenly. Another vehicle crunching through the storm, this one with red strobes faint under snow. Trooper Marquez's cruiser. 30 minutes promised cut to 20 by a woman who never let distance dictate duty, her voice erupting over the radio in Hale's ear. 7, I'm on your 6. Stay low. And then her shotgun roared from the driver's window, a slug that slammed into the pickup's quarter panel and made the assailants dive for cover. The storm became battlefield, light and sound colliding, Ethan pulling the shepherd close, shouting into the SUV to the boy he prayed could hear. "Hold on, Ben, just a little longer," while the woman officer stirred again, lips shaping words he barely caught. "Don't let them take him." And Ethan swore on every scar and oath he carried that he would not tonight, not ever. The pickup's engine sputtered, tires half buried in drifts, and one masked man fled into the trees, swallowed by white, while another raised hands reluctantly under the burn of Marquez's sights, her cruiser slewing sideways into position that boxed them in. But even with the immediate threat checked, Ethan knew this was only a skirmish in something deeper. Because the missing case was still gone, A hostile had escaped into the storm with secrets that had already drawn blood. And the shepherd, shaking from exertion, but unbroken, nosed his way to the SUV's window and pressed his muzzle against the boy's tiny hand like an oath. And Ethan, chest heaving, looked from the child to the woman to the storm-dark woods beyond, and realized that Chapter 2 of this night was over. But Chapter 3, the pursuit into the blizzard's heart, where truth and betrayal waited, was only beginning. The blizzard swallowed the world in a howling white void, and as Trooper Marquez slid from her cruiser with her shotgun cradled tight, her braided crown of hair crusted in ice, she met Ethan Hale's eyes with the quick understanding of two officers who had no luxury for doubt, and she barked against the wind. "You've got wounded?" And he answered by jerking his chin toward the SUV where the woman officer bled slow and stubborn, and the boy Ben lay wrapped in the silver thermal like a fragile ember. And Marquez's face hardened, her tan skin drawn tight against the cold, her eyes black beads of fire. Then she swung the shotgun to cover the surrendered gunman, while Ethan tugged the shepherd closer, the dog leaning against his leg with a trembling mix of pain and purpose, muzzle flecked with blood not his own. And Ethan said through chattering breath, "One fled, Southridge, armed." And Marquez gave the faintest nod that said, "Later, we hunt him." Before she keyed her shoulder mic to call Roz with clipped efficiency. "Dispatch, 2 Alpha 14. We have multiple victims, 1 hostile in custody, 1 hostile fled on foot. Request perimeter units and EMS expedite. We are cold, visibility 0, need fire with winch for extraction." Static hissed. Roz's voice ghosted through, promising wheels turning. But Ethan knew the storm was chewing miles into hours, and for now, they were still alone. He climbed back into the SUV, cradled the boy against his chest, felt the thin flutter of breath warming his collar, then checked the woman again, her pulse weaker, her skin clammy, and he whispered, "Stay with me," as if his voice alone could anchor her to life. She stirred, her lips pale, her eyes slitting open with a will that seemed carved from stone, and she rasped, "Name, Agent Navarro, DHS." And the syllables froze Ethan's veins, because the Department of Homeland Security didn't run casual errands through rural county roads, not in the heart of a storm, not with a child strapped into the seat, and he asked low, urgent, "The case, what was in it?" But her lashes fluttered, consciousness slipping like a kite from fraying string, and she breathed only 2 words, "Biometric. Data," before her eyes rolled closed again, leaving Ethan with the sick understanding that what had been stolen was no drug shipment, no pile of cash, but information, something portable and devastating, the kind of digital skeleton key that could unbolt doors best left sealed. Outside, the captured gunman groaned in the snow, clutching his arm where the shepherd had torn flesh, and Marquez pinned him with a boot, shotgun leveled, her voice a whip crack. "Who sent you?" But the man only spat blood and grinned through broken teeth, the grin of someone who feared a master far more than he feared cuffs or cold. Ethan carried Ben out carefully, setting him into Marquez's cruiser where the heater blasted weak warmth, tucking the thermal tighter, and the boy murmured a dream-thin sound, his first sign of stirring, a mumbled syllable that sounded like, "Mom," and it pierced Ethan deeper than any bullet could because it meant hope. And hope was always heavier than despair. The shepherd limped to the cruiser's flank, slumping but watchful, and Ethan knelt beside him, checked the wound again, ragged, crusted with frozen blood, deeper than a graze but not arterial, and he bound it quick with a strip torn from his undershirt, pressing firm while the dog whined low but held still, eyes never leaving the tree line, as if he alone could hold back the night. Marquez cuffed the wounded gunman, dragged him against her cruiser, then turned to Ethan, her breath fogging fierce. "If biometric data's gone, this is bigger than us. We need federal eyes now." Ethan nodded grimly, glancing back at Navarro slumped in the SUV, her badge glinting faintly under frost, and said, "She is federal eyes. And they tried to erase her. That means we're holding the only witnesses." A crack echoed then, sharp and flat. Not thunder, gunfire from the ridge, a covering shot for the man who had fled, and both officers snapped instinctively behind metal, Marquez shoving the boy lower in her back seat, Ethan dragging Navarro's body across to shield her with the door, and the shepherd snarled deep, fur rising despite the weight of snow. Another shot came, wider this time. Then the fading crunch of boots retreating into the storm, and Ethan knew the enemy had no reason to press, not when they already carried the prize. He holstered his weapon with shaking hands, adrenaline burning down to ash, and he said to Marquez, "They'll regroup. Whoever wanted that case won't stop. This is just the start." She tightened her jaw, eyes cutting through the snow, and said, "Then we make damn sure the kid and the agent live to tell it." Together, they huddled in the storm's iron fist. 3 adults, 1 wounded child, and 1 battered dog, an unlikely fortress against forces they barely understood. And as the night pressed on and sirens crawled through the distance like ghosts, Ethan felt the weight of a new vow settle into his bones. Whatever Navarro had been carrying, whatever data was gone, he was no longer just a county cop in a snowstorm. He was a man standing at the mouth of something vast, with only trust in a wounded K9, a fierce trooper, and his own stubborn heart to keep the dark from swallowing them all. The storm did not relent, but clawed at every surface with sharper claws, snow driven sideways so hard it felt like sand. And as Ethan Hale slammed the SUV door shut to shield Agent Navarro from the bitter cold, he realized the fight was shifting from survival at the crash site to survival on the move, because enemies who fled into the whiteout could circle back, and reinforcements slogging through the drifts would not arrive in time. And so he turned to Trooper Marquez, her braids stiff with ice, her shotgun still hot in her hands, and he said through the wind, "We move now, before they regroup." And she measured him with that hard stare of hers, the kind that weighed truth like gold, then gave a curt nod. "We get the boy warm, the agent stable, then we track them before they vanish with whatever they stole." Together they maneuvered, Ethan lifting Ben gently from the backseat of the battered SUV, the child's small body light as brittle sticks beneath the foil blanket, his head lolling against Ethan's shoulder, while Marquez half-dragged Navarro, the DHS agent's boots carving lines in the snow, her face ghostly pale, but her breathing steadier under the rough bandage Ethan had applied. The shepherd limped beside them, bleeding through his makeshift wrap but refusing to falter, his dark eyes alive with an urgency that told Ethan he would walk until he collapsed rather than leave his humans behind. They loaded both victims into Marquez's cruiser, cranking the heater high, the dashboard glow weak but golden against frost-rimed glass, and as Ethan checked Navarro's vitals, he caught sight of the faint outline of a sidearm holster strapped under her coat. Empty, weapon gone, likely lost in the crash or taken by the attackers. And his stomach tightened at the thought that the ambush had been thorough, calculated, not random opportunists, but professionals. Navarro stirred again, her cracked lips moving, and Ethan leaned close to catch the rasp of her voice. Biometric, profiles, agents, assets, covers, stolen if decrypted. And Ethan felt the bottom drop from his gut, because that meant the case contained information on operatives, identities buried in hostile lands, lives strung up like paper dolls in the wrong hands. And here they were, stranded with the storm and 2 hostiles still unaccounted for. Marquez slammed the door shut, snow rattling like pebbles on the roof, then faced Ethan square, her face lit by the pulsing hazard light, and said, "If they break that data, people die. Not later. Now. You understand?" He did, more than he wanted, and he thought of Caleb Morris, the partner he'd lost, and how shortcuts had cost lives, and he swore with silent teeth he would not repeat it. They decided, hold the injured safe inside the cruiser while they pursued on foot, because waiting meant the enemy widened their lead, and waiting meant the storm buried tracks forever. And so Ethan reloaded his sidearm, checked his flashlight, pulled his hat lower, and looked at the shepherd, who answered with a tired but determined chuff as if saying, "I can still go." Marquez secured the prisoner in the back of her cruiser, double-cuffed and gagged, then armed herself with spare shells and a sidearm from her console, her movements efficient, No wasted energy. The kind of officer who lived ready. Ethan keyed his radio, telling Roz they were pursuing. Voice clipped but calm. And Roz's strained answer came through static. Negative pursuit 7, negative, wait for backup. But Ethan clicked once in acknowledgement and switched the volume low, because the truth was clear. Backup would be too late, and some roads you had to walk yourself. They set off into the blizzard, the shepherd leading by scent, limping but sure, weaving between the skeletal trunks, and Ethan followed with boots breaking crust. Flashlight beam a tunnel through chaos, Marquez covering their rear, her breath ragged clouds, her eyes sweeping every shadow, and time folded into the rhythm of movement. Step, crunch, breath, scan, step again. Until the shepherd stiffened, hackles bristling, nose thrust forward toward a break in the trees where the wind carried something foul, exhaust and smoke. They crouched low, peering through branches, and saw it. A crude camp in the lee of a ridge, a black pickup with one wheel shot, half sunken in snow, tarps strung between trees to break the wind, a fire guttering low, and 3 silhouettes moving with purpose. One larger man heaving the stolen case from the truck bed, another checking a radio with frustrated motions, a third pacing with rifle slung tight, and Ethan's chest tightened at the sight. Because that case, that simple rectangle of plastic and steel, held the fragile threads of lives who had no idea their safety now rested in a snowbound county cop, a state trooper, and a bleeding dog. He exchanged a glance with Marquez, who raised 2 fingers, then pointed. She would flank, he would advance with the shepherd. The storm cloaked them, but nerves burned like wires under skin, because one wrong snap of a twig, and the camp would erupt in fire. Ethan pressed a hand to the shepherd's side, whispered, "Stay low, partner," and the dog obeyed, crawling through snow with painful grace, while Ethan's pistol led the way, every breath timed to the gusts so that sound vanished under the storm's roar, until they were close enough to hear the men's voices, rough and angry. "Signal's dead, no transmission," one cursed. "Then we move manual," said another, lifting the case like it weighed nothing. Ethan's muscles coiled, his scar itched, his father's lessons rang in his ears. Notice what others don't, and he noticed the smallest detail. The pacing guard's rhythm faltered whenever he neared the fire, his eyes flicking not to the woods, but downslope, as if he feared pursuit from below rather than above. And Ethan realized there was still another player, another thread in the storm they hadn't seen yet. He raised his pistol, drew breath to shout the command, and the shepherd growled low, a growl that seemed to make the storm pause. And in that heartbeat before action, Ethan knew that this chase, this night, this blizzard, had only pulled him deeper into a web of secrets he had never asked to hold, but now could not release. Because every step forward was tethered not just to duty, but to the boy in the cruiser, the unconscious agent, and the vow that no more innocence would be buried in ice. The camp below the ridge breathed with menace, fire sputtering in the gale as 3 masked men argued in harsh bursts of sound, and Officer Ethan Hale's breath fogged his sidearm while the shepherd pressed against his leg, trembling but resolute, ears pricked forward as if he alone could sense the heartbeat of danger beyond sight. And in that moment, Ethan knew hesitation would be death. So he broke cover with a voice as sharp as the wind itself. "Police! Drop your weapons!" And time shattered. The pacing guard jerked his rifle up, muzzle flash strobing orange against the snow, but Ethan was already rolling left, firing back with controlled precision, his first round knocking the weapon from the man's hands, his second grazing the shoulder of another who dropped to one knee cursing. While Trooper Marquez erupted from the opposite flank like thunder, her shotgun roaring a deafening answer that split a tarp pole and sent sparks from the truck's mirror, the sudden pincer attack throwing the camp into chaos. The shepherd lunged despite his bandaged leg, teeth clamping onto the thigh of the third man who tried to wrench the stolen case toward the pickup, and his scream cut through the storm like metal tearing, buying Ethan the moment to surge forward, tackle the man at the fire, and drive him into the snow with a grunt that jarred his ribs. The case slid free, spinning to rest against a log, and Ethan's eyes locked on it. Small, unassuming, yet heavier than any weapon, heavier than any fortune, because inside lay the lives of agents who trusted shadows to keep them safe. One gunman broke for the trees, but Marquez dropped him with a slug to the leg that spun him into the drifts, alive but screaming, while the wounded one on his knee raised empty palms, spitting curses through a mask now streaked with blood. Ethan pressed his pistol to the chest of the man he'd tackled, snarled through clenched teeth, "Who sent you?" And the man laughed, a hollow sound that carried no fear of death, and rasped, "Too late. Already sold," before Ethan slammed him unconscious with the butt of his weapon. The shepherd released his grip only when Ethan gave the command, backing off with muzzle stained red, chest heaving but eyes burning with unbroken loyalty. And Ethan dropped to his knees beside the case, fingers trembling as he brushed snow from its surface, seeing the biometric lock screen faintly glowing still, alive but cracked, its data unbreached, for now. Marquez strode to him, breathing hard, braid hanging loose, face grim with frost and fury, and she said, "We hold this until DHS comes, or we die trying." Ethan nodded, feeling the storm begin to ebb as if the world itself sighed at the climax past, sirens faint now in the distance, reinforcements crawling closer through the snow, and for the first time all night, relief brushed him, fragile but real. They dragged the captured men to the pickup, cuffing them to its bent frame, then, together, hauled the case back through the trees, the shepherd limping but refusing to be carried, his head high, a sentinel to the last. When they reached the cruiser, Ben stirred awake fully at last, eyes bleary but alive, whispering, "Mom?" as Agent Navarro's hand, weak but warm, closed over his, her eyes fluttering open with the smallest of smiles, and Ethan felt the weight of everything they had fought for condense into that single human touch: survival, connection, defiance against the storm. Fire crews arrived, then federal vehicles, lights splashing color into white, men and women pouring from them with stretchers and rifles and radios. But for Ethan, the world had already quieted. He stood beside the shepherd, hand resting on the dog's neck, feeling the tremor of exhaustion beneath thick fur, and he whispered, "You did it, partner," because no medal, no report, no speech could encompass what one wounded K9 had carried them through. Later, in the warmth of floodlights and generators, as Navarro was loaded into an ambulance and Ben tucked against her side, Marquez clapped Ethan's shoulder with a weight of gratitude few words could hold, saying simply, "Hell of a night, Hale." He nodded, eyes on the shepherd who lay curled on a blanket, finally allowed to rest, breath steady now under a medic's gentle hands, and he thought of Caleb Morris, of vows forged in ice, of lives saved and secrets preserved, and he knew this storm would haunt him, but not with regret, rather with the echo of a dog's determined eyes that had stopped a cruiser in its tracks, demanding to be followed into destiny. And as dawn finally broke, pale and cold, but merciful, Ethan understood why some stories leave you speechless. Because they are not stories at all, but testaments written in snow, blood, and loyalty, carried on 4 weary paws into the heart of a storm and back again.